Hi, everyone. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and today I'm joined by my friend Kat. You all know Kat from thecreativeintrovert.com. Kat is here today to help me take a look at a comparison between the two presidential candidates in the US election, which happens tomorrow, November 3rd. I want to say a few things before we dive into this, just so that you're all prepared for what kind of um, what kind of talk today's video is going to involve. So we're not really going to dive into the details of what we think is going to happen, and we're not going to try to make our own political cases. The only thing that we're going to do is um, lay out the horary that I did one more time, explain how I judge that horary, and then we're going to go into both Biden's chart and Trump's birth chart. And in doing this, we're going to look at all the transits they have happening right now and try to, in a neutral way, talk about which transits look like they have more of the indication of someone winning the presidency versus which looks like they may have the indications of losing the presidency. And that's really as far as we'll go with it, just out of respect for the fact that I have a very diverse political audience, from people who are totally annoyed by this conversation at all to people who may have a horse in the race, to people who are just from another country and may have an interest in what's going on in US politics and the astrology of it all. It is a historical moment. Most of you guys know, who watch my channel, I don't spend a lot of time talking about things happening in the political arena. I'd much rather focus on, the spiritual kind of path that we're each walking. But in historical moments like this, I do feel like it's interesting to look at the astrology. I also want to say that we will be revisiting there was a horary that I did when Trump had the coronavirus. I won't be revisiting that today. I'm going to let that one play out, because some of the timelines involved in that one have yet to fully play out, and I want to see exactly what happens with some of the things that I had been looking at in that chart before I circle back around to it. But we will, in case people are wondering if I'll come back to that one. Obviously, he recovered from the coronavirus, but there was questions about in that chart that could pertain to other things happening down the road. So we want to just let that one play out a little bit. Um, Also, just a preliminary note, that we'll be looking at a variety of different techniques in each of the two charts that we look at today, some of which you may be able to follow, some of which, may be new to you. And if something doesn't make sense because you don't know the theory or technique that we're using, I will also make sure that we're breaking down that technique in, everyday, speech, so that you can understand it. But for the astrology nerds out there, I will try to provide the sort of technical rationale behind what we're doing as we go. So this kind of thing is not something that's about getting it right. It's just about learning astrology. If we get it right, that's great. But it's a tricky thing to uh, it's not easy to make very specific predictions, and we also have to be very careful that we're not sort of abusing the study and art of astrology, which I don't think is about trying to do David Copperfield magic tricks and prove how great we are by getting something right. So I'm going to provide some of my analysis and my conclusion about which chart I think looks more poised for an election victory. But also, more than that, I'm going to also share with you some of my uncertainties as an astrologer, ways I think I might be getting it wrong in both charts. And that way, depending on what the result is, we can all learn and grow from it, because that's how I process and work with charts in my client practice, and the way I teach astrology for years is not to sit down and feel like I never feel 100% confident or certain of the things that I predict, even on a more very, very basic level and not such a concrete outcome oriented level. So, humility is key. So I just wanted to say all of that first, and thank you for being here. One last note is to please keep it civil in the comments section. I know emotions are running high right now. If we see people being inflammatory or insulting or anything like that, regardless of where you stand on the issues that we're talking about today, we will delete, just because we want to keep the the feed's a place that feels safe for people to exchange. So, okay, all of that's done. Thank you, Kat, for being here. I'm really excited to dive into it with you.
Yeah, I'm excited too. Less about, I mean, for me, I'm less interested in, the outcome of this for your country. But in terms of like the learning part of this, what are the kinds of things that somebody could look at? And we are going to cover a lot of different things that you can look at to see, how would an astrologer reflect on somebody's, how would the natal promise turn out and all of that. So,
Yeah, there's a lot there for sure.
yeah. So are we starting with the horary? Have a recap on that?
Yeah. So, why don't do you want to just explain to people what a horary is really quick?
Yeah,
I'll
so
get it
this is
pulled up here.
sure. So this is a chart that gets cast at the moment a question is asked. Um, yeah, and it's usually best to stick to, it's a pretty simple question, like a yes or no kind of question. So we wouldn't be asking, dear horary astrology, like, who do you think should win?
Right. Right. Or what is the meaning of life?
Yeah.
The horary is going to be used to ask questions, sometimes really fun, quirky questions like, you know, where is my missing laptop? Or I put it somewhere in my house. I don't know where it is. And a horary can literally help you locate a missing object. That's a hard one though, that it's harder to locate missing object, but it is done all the time. Um, Horary can be used to say, will she call me back? We went out on a date. She said she'd get back in touch with me. Will she call me back? And there's techniques that have been used for literally thousands of years, that astrologers have used, in order to methodically read a chart that's cast for the moment of a question. It's like the birth chart of a question, basically. So I cast the chart back in August, and it's important in a horary such as this. You can see it on the screen now, Kat?
Yep.
Okay, good. So it's important in a horary like this to have a horse in the race if you're going to ask a contest or election question, to be someone who can identify which side is which. So when you're asking, and uh, don't, I will just say this right away. I've said this before, but in the political race, I voted for Joe Biden. That's my horse in the race. All respect to everyone who feels differently. Um, and so the ascendant ruler is going to be the one that you have in the race. And um, in this case, Gemini is rising. So Mercury will be the picture of Joe Biden. Um, Saturn will be representative of the incumbent, the king or the queen, as it were, the 10th house ruler, the person who is already in office trying to retain their position. He's represented by Saturn in Capricorn retrograde in the 9th house. Um, so this is immediately one of the things that you notice is that they're both well dignified planets. They both have strength by being in their own sign. Mercury in its own sign in exaltation, Saturn in its own sign. Saturn's a little bit more debilitated because it's in a cadent house and is retrograde, whereas Mercury is both in its sign in exaltation in the 5th house, which was called the house of good fortune, and is a succedent house, is generally stronger than a cadent house. So right away, Biden has, in terms of just the basic essential dignity and accidental dignity, Biden's in a stronger position. And the polls have reflected that here in the US. But we do know that in 2016, there were some pretty big polling errors. So it's not something you just take for granted anymore, at least. And certainly, if you saw the election horary that I presented from 2016, you'll notice that also there were some big mistakes that I made in that horror. If you go back, there was another kind of political talk that I did, and it was called, I think the title was "Will Trump Survive?" Really clickbaity. Sorry about that, everyone. And it was definitely an interesting horary to unpack. Like I said, we'll go back to that one later. But I also unpacked the 2016 election horary and demonstrated how I judged it and how I got it wrong in 2016. So you could check that out. Meanwhile, we want to look anyway at the moon as the voters. The moon will represent the voters in an election horary as it represents the public. And here the moon is in Sagittarius, And what we want to see is whether or not the moon will make aspectual contact with either of the candidates. And in fact, here we see that the moon is going right into a square with Mercury. Now, that would typically mean that the vote goes to at least the popular vote would go to Biden. I mentioned earlier that there is no, I have yet to find a really solid sense of how to take into account the electoral college, which is something separate from the popular vote in the United States. And I'm still unsure about that. So that's maybe the little qualifier here. But the moon, as the voters going to Biden, with Biden in a stronger position overall, would likely depict a Biden victory. So that's how I judged it. And remember, as an astrologer, my political life is really, I'm, some people may find this offensive, but I really don't think that our salvation is in politics. So I'm really not very involved political person. I spend more of my mental, emotional, spiritual energy. The financial contributions I make are typically to spiritual communities and spiritual causes to help people in need, certainly. But I know that we're all political animals and we have to participate. And so I do. But what I'm most interested in is, in this case, will be when I'm sitting down to read a chart like this, is I want to get better at my craft, because my own philosophy, again, whether you agree or not, I respect all of you out there, but my own philosophy is that we get the candidate that we deserve karmically, and that's hard to swallow, I know, but I in other words, I try to understand that the political things happening in the world are a reflection of where we're at and some of the lessons that we need to learn. So I don't go in with a strong feeling of, oh, please, please, please let my person win. I have someone in the race that I want to win, but I'm not attached to, because I realize I'm not in control of everything, basically, right? And the universe has a greater intelligence than I may be able to comprehend. So I sometimes people think that astrologers can't go into such a question objectively. And I really think that, you can, especially if you pay attention to what ancient astrologers said about politics as well, which was, astrology was involved with politics, but the life of the astrologer was in contemplation of things that went beyond the constant dualities and sort of, battles of this world. So that's kind of where I stand on that in terms of, do I feel like I was able to be objective? Because I had a ton of people ask me that last time. Like, if you have someone that you want to win, can you be objective? And I think the answer to that for me was yes. Because also, if I get this wrong, I want to know why and how I got it wrong. And that's really important to me. And I don't think that I would have gotten it wrong because I wasn't objective. I think I will have gotten it wrong because I didn't see something correctly in the chart. So that's where I'm at with it right now. But does that all make sense so far, Kat?
It does. I did have a question, which you probably did cover the last time, but the fact that the moon is in Sagittarius, where Mercury is in its full detriment, right?
Detriment.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, typically there's two paths that you have, and this is how my teachers have taught me. If there is no aspectual connection between the moon and one of the two candidates, then you would look at receptions. But if the moon is going straight into an aspect with one of the two, receptions aren't necessary, that it's just a clear picture of the vote going to one of the candidates. So good question, because the moon is in Sagittarius, which is the detriment of Mercury. So someone could say, well, the moon doesn't have high regard for Mercury. But an aspectual connection would you'd put that a step above the reception.
Cool.
Yeah.
And in terms of, we're going to be looking at the natal charts next, but how does that interplay? Like, can a horary chart kind of like trump, how to use that word, the natal chart, natal promise?
Well, that's what we're going to see, right? Is what we're trying to do next is look at the natal charts and see if the natal charts and what's happening in the natal charts in the near future seem to confirm or corroborate the judgment of the horary. And I think that in a case like this, if you're trying to learn and you're studying as a participant in history, as well, it's like you want to compare those because that's a great learning opportunity, but you wouldn't need to look at their charts to make a decision at all. In fact, the only reason I'm doing so is really because I want to learn myself in a historical moment like this. It's a really vivid example of astrology, and so if there is a comparison that could be made between their individual birth charts and the horary I cast, whether I get it right or wrong, that's really you're going to learn a lot by going through that process.
So you're thinking that it's always going to line up, that a horary can or cannot.
The horary should line up with the birth chart. There should not be yeah, like I would say I can't think of an occasion where I've gotten a horary right, and in looking at the birth chart, haven't seen corroborating transits or timing periods connecting with the natal chart.
Sure.
Yeah. But in the cases where I have gotten it wrong and looked at the birth chart, um, typically it's probably because I wasn't understanding the context of the natal chart and the transits within that context well enough. In other words, um, oh, that looks like a positive transit, but I'm not reading the natal chart carefully enough to see whether or not this person really has positive karma around that particular area or not. You see what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
And there are so many variables. So
Right, exactly. And that's what makes it really make it really challenging. But so the only thing in this chart that really makes me scratch my head, aside from the reception point that you mentioned, because that was definitely on my list too. I thought, moon's in the detriment of Mercury, but going to the square, and that would typically, win out. But the moon, in this case, the other thing that is interesting, um, is that the moon goes right into right after it makes the square to Mercury, it goes into a conjunction through Antitia with Jupiter. Now, if I had a candidate for the Electoral College, I would probably use the 11th house, um, almost like the 11th house. If you think of it, the 11th house is the ministers or the counselors of the king. If the 10th is the nation, then the 11th are the states and the Electoral College. That's one reasoning that I've heard a number of astrologers give before that's resonated with me. If the moon goes into a conjunction with the Electoral College, right? Um, the Electoral College, this is what confounds me a little bit, is that the voters are ruled by the Electoral College, and the Electoral College, represented by Jupiter, um, is in the detriment of the moon, the voters, and in the rulership of Saturn, Trump. Then one pathway to victory would be again for him to lose the popular vote but win the Electoral College.
And one question, because I know that you chose that Saturn represents Trump here, but would it ever be the seventh house
It would be the seventh
ruler?
house if it was an opponent who hadn't been previously elected and wasn't an
Sure.
incumbent. So you're
Okay.
you're thinking of him as the 10th because he's the current king.
Cool.
Yeah. So that's the answer, is that I think, again, like the thing about the Antitia with Jupiter, the 11th house ruler, and so forth, that gives me room for pause. That's my question mark here, is if it happens to be, this will kind of confirm for me to look at the 11th house as the Electoral College in the future. If I get it wrong and he wins the popular vote but loses the Electoral College, then I'll kind of know, okay, it's the 11th house ruler I've got to look at, and see if that's figuring into the horary in the future elections in a really strong way. And in this case, um, I'm suspicious about it because 2016, although Biden looked like, or Clinton at that point looked like she had the clear lead, lost very narrowly in the Electoral College. And there was a lot of polling errors. We're seeing narrow leads in a lot of battleground states, and in some cases within the margin of error for polls. And so there was a quote I heard, I don't know, somewhere yesterday. I saw a clip or a meme or a quote or something, and it said, "This is the closest 10-point. This is the most competitive 10-point lead that I've ever seen." So nationally, Biden has something like a 10-point lead, some polls say, but the actual, the lead, if you look at how close the battleground states are, could tell a totally different story. And in this case, the fact that the moon would again go to Mercury, but then immediately hit the Antitia to the fallen Jupiter. The other thing that makes me suspicious is that Jupiter is about to go into a conjunction with Pluto, and that fallen Jupiter in conjunction with um, Pluto could certainly signify, the controversy of the Electoral College, which was such a huge part of the last election cycle. Regardless of what side you're on, I'm just saying it could certainly signify deep questions and doubt and scrutiny about the justice system or the Electoral College itself.
How much weighting does the Electoral College have?
Well, basically, the way that it works is, you have the popular vote, which is just the overall vote total, you could say, and then you have each state. And each state, if you win the state, most states, then you'll get, if you win that state, then all of the electoral votes from that state go to the candidate. And the candidate has to get 270 of the total electoral votes. So it's basically, you have to win and every state has a different number of electoral votes based on, their size and so forth. So California has a huge amount of electoral votes. Texas, Florida, New York, big populations. They got a lot of votes, if I understand it correctly. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. Um, and so if they win certain numbers of states in certain areas and the number of electoral votes per state adds up to 270, then they win. In this case, again, like, I just find it interesting that the popular vote would typically be the moon, whereas I think the Electoral College is probably represented by something else. In which case, you could make a case here that though the popular vote goes to Biden, it immediately then hits Jupiter, has poor reception with the fallen Jupiter, who is in the rulership of Trump's signifier. So I wouldn't be shocked at all if that was the case, if I got it wrong because he lost the popular vote, or he wins the popular vote, Biden does, but then loses the Electoral College. I think it's also, at the very least, a good possibility, as everyone is saying anyway, that there's something contested about the result. We have too many things in the sky right now to suggest that this goes completely peacefully, I think. I'll show you. Let me just bring up the transits right now and show you why. Again, some people would say that it won't go peacefully because Trump won't let go. Some people would say that there'll just be contested results in the courts. I mean, there's a lot of people for different reasons saying that it may not go smoothly. Now, do we see anything to sort of warrant some level of corruption, scandal, or controversy in either direction, wherever you may stand? Yes, we can see this because on election day, tomorrow, you're going to see Mercury stationing in Libra in a square with Saturn. Now, the planets no longer have any of the meaning that they did in the horary. We're just talking generally now. That turning direct would suggest the potential for blockages or obstacles in negotiating something, or if you're talking about a peaceful transition of power in either direction. Mercury in Libra, the sign of the balance, square Saturn, isn't a great picture of that necessarily. It could represent finality or completion or some kind of karmic leveling moment, but I'm convinced that there will probably be some really heated days ahead of us, because look at what's going to happen. If you go forward to about November 9th and 10th, you're going to see Venus opposing Mars. That has the look of conflict, right? And if you're talking about a peaceful transition of power and Venus is in Libra, great. But if it's going to oppose Mars in Aries, good luck. It seems to me more like a sign of conflict. And at the same time, what do you see? You see Jupiter and Pluto conjoining basically on the very day that Venus will oppose Mars. I would guess that by the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th of November, we're going to see some kind of resolution or some kind of culminating conflict over the election, um, regardless of which way it goes, because of these aspects that are culminating all simultaneously. And there is some question about corruption or scandal with Jupiter in its fall conjoined with Pluto, and power, and those themes. It also, are, what's interesting is I do think that at the end of this, things will be, there will be some kind of acceptance of results. You've got Venus in the overcoming position to all of these planets, and we'll go through the square to all of these planets, by the end of November. We're in eclipse season coming up, at the end of November into December. Those kinds of things to me say, this isn't going to drag on forever. There probably will be a period of duking it out, that is followed by some peaceful transition. So um, we also see by December 21st, this figures into both of their birth charts that we're going to look at, Jupiter and Saturn conjoining in Aquarius. That is usually the sign of a new beginning. Not always, it, not always necessarily, doesn't necessarily mean good. So there's going to be some people that feel like it represents a beginning that's not so great. There's going to be some people that feel that it represents a beginning that's great. But in terms of the fear that we're going to be dealing with some lingering liminal space forever, I think with eclipses coming through, Venus overcoming these planets, the Jupiter Pluto conjunction moving off, Jupiter and Saturn getting out of Capricorn and conjoining in Aquarius. By the end of this year, there will be a transition and a very new phase, and that phase is going to be very motivating, because Jupiter and Saturn's conjunctions are very motivating for people, especially ideologically. So there's there's going to be a lot of political and social and philosophical and ideological kind of zeal in the air. And we're going to talk a lot about that when I do a future series on Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius. But okay, does that all make sense, Kat? Any questions that come up while I'm going over that?
I don't think I have any really good questions. I mean, I am sort of just thinking about maybe you don't want to go there, but like the state of the nation and people rebelling again. You've been talking specifically about the result, maybe, and the Venus opposite Mars thing, but could that possibly reflect on people in general as
Oh,
opposed to just the potential candidates?
yeah. Think about, Venus retrograde periods have long been associated with, let me just stop this for now. They've long been associated with civil and social and even romantic or relational unrest, Venus retrograde periods. Well, look at what happened when Venus went retrograde this spring into the summer. When George Floyd was killed, um, there were huge demonstrations, really broke out all over the world, and a lot of social unrest. And there were demonstrations, from a lot of different groups competing. And there's social unrest, and there's peaceful protest, and then there's riots, and they're right next to each other in the visualization of what's happening. That's Venus when Venus goes retrograde, or when Venus gets into really heavy dynamics with other planets. There's in the name of peace, or in the name of beauty or justice, things that Venus cares about by virtue of being, both the ruler of Taurus and the ruler of Libra, beauty and fairness and balance and so forth. When Venus hits this opposition to Mars, it could certainly be at least a temporary period of unrest. Or I know, like, for example, I had a friend of mine who lives in DC, where we used to live, and she was posting pictures of people in preparation for potential unrest boarding up their shops in downtown DC right now. So I don't think we're saying anything that's radically outside of everyone's imagination already. But yeah, Venus opposite Mars would be social, civic unrest potentially. But Venus does overcome in the overcoming superior square to Jupiter, Pluto, Saturn. So I have confidence that, we'll get through this.
Cool. All right, should we look at the charts?
Yeah. Which one should we do first?
How about the current king?
All right, we'll look at Trump's. Okay, so Trump's chart first. Let me just pull it up, make sure I've got it the right one. So these charts, by the way, are, they have A or double A ratings, which means that there's some debate about Trump's ascendant and whether he's a Virgo or Leo rising. I take the chart that has him as a 29-degree Leo rising and work with that particular chart. But Biden's chart and his chart are, there's enough out there that astrologers feel confident with the times. So just so you know that that's where the data is thought to be double A rated for Donald Trump, online copy of his birth certificate, and for Biden as well. So, all right, here's Trump's chart. Can you see it on the screen now?
Yes.
All right, so what we're going to do is we're just going to say what's the current state of astrology in Trump's chart and what does it suggest. And I'm going to go through, a bunch of different things and unpack why I think his chart says in correspondence with the horary that there's a case to be made that he loses the election. But I will also share with you some of my doubts and ways in which I think the chart could be pointing to him winning. All right, so here is a couple of them. I'm not gonna pull up a bi-wheel and stuff like that. I'm just gonna try to outline these very basically. And I'll pause, ask, and make sure that if they make sense and everything like that. Okay, so first thing that's happening in the near future is that he's going through the same types of eclipses that were present when he was born in Gemini and in Sagittarius. Now, certainly with Rahu, the North Node, hanging over the sun right now, there's two basic ways of looking at eclipses in the sign of your sun. One is typically that when you have eclipses in the sign of your sun, it means that let's back up and say that the sun represents our sense of life purpose, life path, life direction. And eclipses over the sun will then typically coincide with the darkening or ending or closure of one pathway or direction that we've been taking in life and the starting of another. We can see this coming up on November 30th with a lunar eclipse in the 10th house. So you've got a lunar eclipse happening in the 11th house in the same sign as the sun, which again, reading it through the lens of the horary and the results there and seeing if they corroborate, one piece of evidence would be that, eclipses bring pretty serious changes of direction in your life. A change of direction happening during an election could be argued to be evidence of someone who is about to leave office, not stay in office. Of course, if, let's say, the Senate flips to the Democrats, but he remains in power, his life is going to get a lot more difficult in terms of trying to govern. In which case, the eclipses there could mean that the colleagues, the 11th house of colleagues and allies and benefactors, is changing significantly as he doesn't, say, have the Senate any longer. Maybe you could make the case that, the change in direction means that his victory will lead him to a very, very different second term. There'll be a whole new different set of themes and challenges. So I would accept that argument. But I think it's more likely, usually when I see eclipses in my client practice, it's not that someone is just going to stay status quo. There's going to be some very distinct change to their sense of direction. So that's my first piece. Does that make sense, Kat?
Yeah, and I might have missed it, but the fact that this is like a nodal return,
Yep. Yeah,
would
nodal
that
returns. Go ahead.
I just would have thought that that kind of like would have amplified what he's already got, or no?
The way that I work with nodal returns is typically that these are major karmic crossroads in our lives. Usually that represent the closing of old chapters and the beginning of new chapters in a very dramatic fashion. So if he's at the beginning of a new chapter change, we can only guess to a certain extent what kind of chapter change that is and try to piece it together with other things.
Cool.
That's how I would read it. Good question, though. Um, that he's also going to get he's going to have in December, he will also have a solar eclipse on the moon and the south node. Now, what I find interesting about that is that you have a lunar eclipse, which typically signifies endings coming over the sun, whereas you have a solar eclipse typically suggesting beginnings coming over the moon, who is the 12th house ruler. The 12th house is, of course, the place of things such as uh, being fired from your job, or resignation, or exile, or a liminal space, a kind of in between space, a now what's next space. We know that if he leaves office, it's very likely, whether you care for him or not, that he will face multiple legal cases, and some of which could involve prison sentencing. So the solar eclipse on the 12th house ruler, the moon, maybe in addition to the fifth house, you could see associated the moon and the south node. Is there's often a theme of escape, and he has mentioned at some of his rallies, if I lose, what'll I do? Maybe I'll go to another country. That seems really fantastical to me. It also seems fantastic to me that he would go to prison, but not fantastic in a good way, in a bizarre, like it's hard for me to imagine it. But the ruler of the 12th getting the solar eclipse and the moon being with the south node, the south node being a diminishing place, that doesn't give me confidence that there's a new beginning in his life coming that represents an amplification of strength and power. Rather, new direction coming as the result of leaving power, or of coming into a more 12th house time in your life. So those are the first two things that I'm looking at here, but you could speculate about a lot of other things too. So that's where I'm at with these eclipses so far. Does that make sense, Kat?
Yeah, it does. Interesting.
Okay. The next piece that we're going to go to is major transits in his birth chart right now. So he's got Jupiter, Pluto, and Saturn all opposing his natal Venus, Saturn, in the 12th. This also points to, again, 12th house themes being very prominent right now. And Venus, Saturn in the 12th, to me, could be representative, again, of, if I was doing this for anyone and I saw that coming, I would ask, for example, do you have any kind of legal battles that are going on right now? Or are you going through a divorce, or, potential strife and conflict with allies or friends, or in the workplace, or something like real potential for real hostility and conflict? The sixth house was called the joy of Mars, the house of bad fortune and conflict. And the 12th was called bad spirit, and it was associated with trials and imprisonment and things like that. So that doesn't look good. I'm not confident that that's a picture of a picture of victory. Even if it were victory, I would be like, there's going to be some really choppy waters ahead and some really intense conflicts, which could result in a person losing key allies or relationships, or paying penalties, or dealing with the fallout of broken relationships or something like that. So it's definitely not, those are not easy transits in this chart that are coming up. So that also, gives me pause. However, if I were to play a little, devil's advocate, kind of jump on the other side, his Saturn is enclosed by the benefics. You've got Jupiter on this side and Venus on this side. So that Saturn is fairly protected in his chart, the malefic Saturn. And I think there's a case to be made that he certainly has a way of, what do they call him? The Teflon Don, nothing sticks to him. So there's something to that in his birth chart, actually. So that kind of makes me feel like, you know, I don't know if this would mean disaster, really, if he was born with a benefic enclosure around Saturn. But conflict ahead for sure, with these transits, I think. Now, the last transit that I'm interested in is Neptune, who in the year ahead is going to go through squares not only to his nodal axis but both to his sun and moon from the 8th house, which is also a place associated with um, pot- potential hardships, right? So we'll just keep it general like that rather than going into it all. So that's worrisome to me because a Neptune square to the lights also suggests to me a big changes in terms of the environment, moon, which is very basic. The moon is like the general picture of karmic circumstance in life, fortune, as it was called by the ancient astrologers, and the sun, spirit, where am I heading? So he's at a real crossroads right now. And I don't see Neptune transits often come through without some really intense sense of displacement that goes on, at least temporarily, when it hits squares to the lights. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what comes next. I'm not doing this thing that I was doing anymore. That is so common for Neptune squares to the lights.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like going to like somewhere stable or finding this like nice firm place.
Yeah, and so it would be my guess that even if he did have a second term, that it would be really tumultuous, because of this square. And one could speculate that that might be again because the Senate is flipped somehow. Anyway, um, now as he's going into the election, let's look at his annual perfection from the ascendant. He's in a third house um, perfection year, right? So he does have Jupiter in that third house of Libra, which would be beneficial, and it is ruled by Venus, right? So, however, one thing that to me is a big red flag here is that during a perfection year, the ruler of the year, you want to pay really close attention to aspects that that planet is receiving during that perfection year. As the election comes across, we have a fallen Jupiter, Pluto, and Saturn all opposing um, the ruler of the year from within the 12th house. That doesn't give me great confidence either, to be completely honest with you. So, however, again, there's the benefic enclosure in the 12th. So there's a way in which he tends to come through things unscathed. But that to me says, okay, um, you know, the ruler of the year is getting major afflictions right during the election. That's room for concern for me. Okay. That makes sense?
Yeah, yeah, totally.
Okay, so I think what we'll do now is I'm going to go into the zodiacal releasing periods. So just this is now I'm not going to I'll just go through them very loosely, because it's a pretty complicated technique. But zodiacal releasing periods are a bit like, like the Hindu dasha periods. They're periods of life that are like, it's like your life is like a book, and they're breaking it down into chapters. That's a really nice analogy that I think I heard Chris Brennan first use. So different chapters, and in the chapters there's different pages and paragraphs and sentences, so you can break big time periods down into smaller chunks. Trump is in a Cancer moon ruled 12th house period of 25 years that started in 2000. So first of all, on like level 1 of his life, since 2000, which is right around the time that he first got the inclination to run for office. In fact, it was believe it was between, like 1998 and 99 or something like that. But it was right around 2000 that really a part of his life where he had first formed, I think, a committee to look into running for president in the late 90s. And then 2000 starts a 25-year-long period, 12th house Cancer. He hits what is called, so first of all, he's in a 12th house period right now. That is the most dominant theme in his chart. In zodiacal releasing terms, you got to start with level 1. 12th house is not necessarily an easy place, and it's ruled by the moon. Remember, it's that moon that gets eclipsed here coming up in December. When we break down that zodiacal releasing period on level 2, take the 25 years and start breaking it down into sub-periods. Between December of 2017 and March of 2020, he hits what's called a loosing of the bond period ruled by Saturn. Usually that also marks a major change of life direction. Releasing from the lot of spirit in the chart is like tracking out the chapters of your life that have to do with your ambitions and intentions and actions. What are you doing? What are you pursuing? What are your ambitions right now? So between 2017 and 2020, while he's the president, he is going through this loosing of the bond period ruled by Saturn. Remember, Saturn's in his 12th house natally. And so it's a great period of tumultuousness that would typically lead to a very important turning point in terms of your life direction, just like the eclipses coming through. So again, from that standpoint, the fact that he's coming out of that during an election year would signal to me that, and we'll see this in Biden's chart too. For example, Biden has a loosing of the bond going into the election in 2024, which would probably mean that he's only a one-term president. If he is, that would be a guess that I would have in advance. But at any rate, so he is, he's going now on level 2. He's going from March of 2020 all the way to September of 2022. He's in an Aquarius period, which is where the lot of fortune is located, in his 7th house. And that means that it's sometimes referred to as a peak period. So it is a very busy period for him. But again, being Saturn ruled and coming off a loosing of the bond, I would anticipate this to be less than a fortunate peak period, because also Saturn, the ruler of this period, is in the 12th house, receiving oppositions from Pluto, fallen Jupiter, etc. So at any rate, you also have, by the way, if you go down to level 3, between October 15th and December 17th of this year on level 3, he's in a Cancer 12th house period. So you're seeing a lot of that emphasis on the 12th house and on Saturn. And that makes me think of someone who may be approaching, sort of the 12th house theme of exile, leaving the status quo behind and so forth. Now, if you release from fortune, which has a different timing technique, same zodiacal releasing, but releasing from the lot of fortune rather than spirit, and we're looking at things that may kind of fall to the native, meaning that they just sort of happen, things that happen to you from without. Important to look at that too. He's in a 20-year-long Gemini period in the 11th house. And from April of 2020 to July of 2022, right now, if you break it down, he's on level 2, he's in a Saturn-ruled Capricorn period, back to Saturn again. So you see all the emphasis on Saturn for him right now, and then Saturn's receiving the opposition from Pluto, from the fallen Jupiter. It's in the 12th house. That doesn't give me, again, none of that gives me confidence of seeing someone rising in power. It probably spells more like the beginning of a transitional state that's probably more challenging or tumultuous, which we can see going back to the start of his actual presidency, if you want to read it in that way, because that was a Saturn-ruled loosing of the bond period in Capricorn. Okay, last but not least are his progressions. I want to pull them up on the screen and show you his actual progressions right now. Okay, can you see his progressions on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, so all right. Interesting things happening here. He just started a new moon in a progressed lunation cycle in the 12th house. All right, so there's something new happening in his life. It's a little 12th housey, right? So you see the same theme repeating over and over again in the progressions. Then let me see here. Really, really interesting. If we progress this, let me just see if I can actually do this on the screen. If we progress this a little bit, let's go by days. Look at the progressed ascendant. Right now, he's got Jupiter, Venus, Mars, all in the first house. Pretty strong, right? But look at that ascendant at 2951 Libra. Let's progress that a little bit and go into see what happens and see when it's going to flip signs, because that changes the whole chart, the whole progressed chart. Okay, so December 15th, December 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th. Oh, are you kidding me? It's going to happen right on the winter solstice, basically, just after, which is a huge day for us astrologically this year. Watch what happens. The day after the winter solstice, basically on the winter solstice, his ascendant changes signs into Scorpio, at which point the ruler of his chart becomes a debilitated Mars in the 12th house. And then we have everything changes signs in his chart. Then all of a sudden you've got Saturn at the midheaven in the 10th house. And at the same time, you have within not too long after that, by September of 2021, his new moon will progress into the 12th house as well. So his progressions, to me, also really pointed at the 12th house as being a really an area that is becoming more. It's like everything keeps pointing to it. So the 12th house is that space that you find yourself in when you're in between, when you're done with something but haven't found the new thing, when you're wandering, when you're in exile. It could mean things like courtroom and litigation, and even penalties or imprisonment. So those are the reasons that I feel not so strong about his case for the presidency within his birth chart. Now, everyone should know that I'm also reading through the lens of what the horary said. So I look at the horary and I say, okay, the horary seems to point to Biden winning. I know there's some reasons I could get it wrong. So I look at Trump's chart and I just try to find what stands out. Ascendancy of power, rank, fame, mastery, or potential themes of diminishment or loss. And you see major transition period coming up where question of purpose is huge, especially with the Neptune squares and the eclipses and so forth. And it would be hard for me to imagine the degree of intensity around life direction that all of these things in his chart point to right now without him going in a very different direction after the election. So that's why I've made that judgment. But I could be wrong. And if I am wrong, we'll revisit this. We'll do like a recap and try to go in and explore what these transits might end up meaning or pertaining to, not only after the election, but maybe say 6 months from now or 12 months from now or something like that. So that's my promise to everyone watching this, is we'll try to go back in and explore, how we got it wrong if we did. Okay. I'll stop there for now, Kat.
Cool. Yeah, one thing that little observation is that Mercury will be stationing direct, basically, I think like a degree away from his progressed Jupiter in the 12th, or is that in the first? The progressed chart.
I see. Yeah, his progressed Jupiter. Yeah, Mercury's stationing direct will be on his progressed Jupiter. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, and I was wondering if that has anything to do with, like a change of, fortune. Going back on your words. deception of any
Ye-
kind?
Yeah, it could. I would probably. Um, I'm hesitant with transits to the progressed chart. I almost never use, you know, transits to the progressed chart. I just look at what's happening in the progressed chart and the aspects within it. That's typically how I work with them.
Cool.
But yeah, it's an interesting point either way. Um, okay. Shall we go on to Joe Biden's chart?
Yeah, let's do it.
Any questions that you can think of in advance before we pull his chart up?
No, let's get into looking at it.
All right, here we go. Okay, I'm putting his chart on the screen. Interesting that he also has a bunch of planets in the 12th, right? So I'm not surprised that politicians do. I could maybe do a talk on that another time, but okay, so now I'm going to unpack some of the similar transits and look at what's happening in Biden's chart. So first of all, let's take a look at the eclipses. You have a lunar eclipse coming up in the seventh house in Gemini in his chart in late November, November 30th. And then in December, you have a solar eclipse in the first house in Sagittarius. So, you know, when you think about a solar eclipse in the first house, that's usually a moment of personal empowerment. That's where you see people launching a new business, getting a promotion. That's usually the solar eclipse in the first is usually where you see, people sort of their life path is changing a lot. And in the first house, it's usually very inceptional. They're starting something new. And it's a big life change. It's in an angular house like that. The lunar eclipse in the seventh is very interesting because it could signify, for example, I've seen it more times than I can count, lunar eclipses in the seventh signifying the end of conflicts in, say, divorce proceedings. The seventh house was called the setting place and is associated not only with relationships or enemies or opponents, but is associated with uh, resolution and conclusion. Like if you're finishing your PhD and you're writing a doctoral dissertation and you finish it, it can be a very seventh house kind of moment because this is where planets set and hence conclude their work from start in rising to finish in setting. So you look at the end of November and there's a lunar eclipse in the seventh. That would often signal, remember, lunar eclipses, resolution, completion, finality. So there's a real theme of resolution and ending something that has to do with an opponent or perhaps a contention with someone else. Whereas then in the middle of December, you have a solar eclipse that's just about a couple of degrees off from the lot of victory in his first house. The lot of victory is a Jupiterian lot that often signifies moments of winning or promotion or gain or real increase. So you're seeing this solar eclipse, a sign of new beginnings in his first house, right pretty close to the lot of victory. I think that's really interesting. It's interesting to note, by the way, as an aside, and this is just kind of kooky stuff, throwing out some lots, but well, I'll come back to that one with Trump at the end. That'll be better. There's one with Trump too, a lot, an Arabic or a traditional lot that's interesting to look at. So the eclipses in that regard speak to me about a beginning, in Biden's life coming up that seems quite powerful, and the end of a conflict or the resolution of some kind of conflict with a solar eclipse in the seventh house where he has Saturn natally. We know that he's had conflicts in relationships or challenges in relationships going back to the death of his first wife, I believe. So the Saturn in there and an eclipse pretty close to the Saturn in that sign, by the way. I believe I have to check. Let me just check really quick because I think it's like pretty closely conjoined with that Saturn. Let's just see here. So Saturn was at what, 8 or 9 degrees? Yeah, so it's like 9 degrees. So it's going to be smack dab. The lunar eclipse is smack dab on Saturn in the seventh house. And you'll see that the status of Saturn in his chart right now is very important. Saturn was retrograde when he was born. He's getting an eclipse right on that Saturn. And in his progress chart, Saturn, which is his ascendant ruler in his progress chart, is just about to turn direct. So there's some resolution of seventh house Saturn karma that's happening. And I would tend to see the lunar eclipse on Saturn in the seventh with his progressed Saturn turning direct while being born with it retrograde as a sign of overcoming something or someone, some difficulty in the seventh house. And then the solar eclipse in the first house, which I would take as more of a sign of empowerment, especially since it's near the lot of victory. All right. Then we have Jupiter and Saturn will enter Aquarius on the winter solstice. And just as they enter Aquarius on the winter solstice, Jupiter and Saturn conjunction, remember it signifies new beginnings, goes into a very perfect square with the exalted moon in the house of conflict. And I would see that as favorable because he's got the moon in a lot of fortune, an exalted moon with a lot of fortune in the sixth house of conflict, along with Uranus stationing on the lot of fortune in his sixth house. I would see this as a sign of what does an exalted planet in the sixth house look like? Oftentimes, it's the ability to overcome adversity, overcome tragedy, overcome misfortune or conflict. And just like Trump has the benefic enclosure in his chart, an exalted moon in the sixth with a lot of fortune strikes me as being able to overcome different forms of adversity and finding good fortune. And then you have Jupiter, Saturn conjoining in Aquarius on the 21st in the square with the exalted moon, while Uranus, planet of liberation and freedom, is sitting right on the lot of fortune. While, again, you also have just had the eclipse on the Saturn, while the Saturn in the progress chart is turning direct in the seventh. Both are signs of overcoming something as far as I can tell. I'll have to reassess all of this, of course, and really think about it and try to hold it or turn the jewels differently if I'm wrong about all of this, obviously. So let's see. Now, one thing that is interesting is, let's see here. This one's just kind of wacky, and I don't know what to make of it, really, honestly. But let me put this in. I had a lot of different thoughts about this one. So this one, if you guys also have ideas about it, I'd love to hear what you guys think. But notice the IC in his chart at 19 Pisces. Can you see that, Kat?
Yep.
All right. So that's getting a conjunction from Neptune right now. You know what do you know what I've seen that entail hundreds and hundreds of times in my practice? People moving. Neptune at the IC. I'm moving. I'm packing up. Well, what would he be doing in the next couple of months? He'd be moving. He'd be moving to the White House. I found that interesting. Now, I've also seen it as a sign of death in the family, or sometimes in the case of people who are very old, I've actually seen it as death. The other thing that really concerns me about this chart is that the Jupiter Saturn square to the moon in the sixth could also be a signification of health problems.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
And also the eclipse in his first house could also be a sign of, I mean, new beginnings, yes, but when someone's that old, sometimes eclipses in the first house will hit your health pretty hard. So I could see the one thing that I could sort of not anticipate in all of this would be that would be sort of a counter narrative to what I've put forward so far with Biden's chart would be some significant health problems popping up, even if he did win, but that looks like it could be a challenge, but that would be a potential challenge that I would see. Possibly with his wife too, or family issues, something in the family coming up. I know that there's been some controversy around his sons and so forth, or his son. So possibly that family karma is also really pronounced somehow in here. Now, you also have Saturn, Jupiter, and Pluto all going through oppositions to his ascendant ruler in the eighth house. That's another thing that makes me go like, ooh, health, ascendant ruler, eclipse in the first house, square to moon in the sixth house of illness. Um, you know, Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto, all opposing uh, natal Jupiter. He does have an exalted Jupiter, and disposed of by the exalted moon. So I would tend to think of the escaping the worst, somehow surviving, this a story of survival despite the worst, which has been a big part of his life story. For example, with the car accident that took some of his family members, and so he's definitely had some really close scrapes with things, but tends to come out okay. So this is concerning, this transit to Jupiter. And I've seen a lot of astrologers actually out there saying that this alone suggests that he wouldn't win because you've got a fallen Jupiter opposing his ascendant ruler. But I don't think so. I think it could represent a challenge that's overcome, because that's what exalted planets tend to do, that you rise up somehow. But that's another thing that's happening here. But you have to look at the natal context. Exalted ascendant ruler getting a hard transit versus versus the malefic in the 12th house and all of the 12th house energy and trumps. This isn't perfect, but it looks better to me overall.
And what happens if the new president, let's say he did get sick, would the vice president like take over?
I don't know how that works
Yeah, I don't.
when you've been elected but have not yet been sworn in. I have no idea how that would happen, but wouldn't that just be the cherry on the cake of 2020, the cherry on the top. So anyway, but I do think that this probably is more about overcoming different elements of opposition or hostility. So then and that, like, I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to paint anyone to be evil here. I'm just saying, just challenge that this, to me, the exalted Jupiter getting the oppositions from the fallen Jupiter suggest having to overcome something, and that you will, because the natal karma is sort of there with the exalted moon and Jupiter to do so, and they're both getting aspected. So when you see exalted planets receiving aspects in charts, that's usually an indicator of something increasing in fortune, maybe with some difficulties because you got squares and oppositions going on, but generally speaking, that's how I would read it. Now let's look a little bit at his zodiacal releasing periods next. Does that sound good?
Yep, yeah.
Okay. So again, just kind of, doing this, zooming out. By contrast, Biden has been in a 10th house period, arguably one of the most powerful zodiacal releasing periods on level 1 since 2005. That's a Virgo period. So you got about 20 years. From 2019 September to September of 2021, he is in a moon-ruled Cancer period, which also features his exalted Jupiter and is ruled by an exalted moon. Not easy, but again, the exalted planets both in and ruling the period are very positive, with Jupiter hitting the square to the moon at the very end of the year here. That's a really good sign. In terms of just being able to overcome things or succeed in various endeavors. If someone were asking me, will I get the job or what's going to happen? I would be like, well, if this is your birth chart, these transits should speak to, again, you're in a period that's not entirely easy with the 8th house, Cancer, but you've got an exalted Jupiter in that place and it's ruled by an exalted moon. Now he has a loosing of the bond between April of 2023 and April of 2024 in Pisces, Jupiter ruled theme. Makes me think that even if there was like a health scare, and let's say, maybe he survives, maybe that's another theme, surviving a health scare. But regardless, this would strike me as evidence that in 4 years, when the next election cycle comes up, you have a loosing of the bond. It's very much like Trump. So this would suggest to me that his real turn of direction comes at the tail end, by the way, of this whole 20-year period that he's in the 10th house, concluding a 20-year career period right around the time of the next election, with a loosing of the bond coming up to it. And that loosening of the bond is on, be on, let me just check and make sure I speak correctly about that. It's on level, okay, it would be, yeah, it's on level 2 between April of 2023 and April of 2024. And that's winding down a 20-year long 10th house period for him. So you see how that would kind of mark the end of his career. So that makes me feel confident about that.
I think the day of tomorrow, he's going to be going into that level 4 Taurus period where he has the lot of fortune.
That's right. That's correct. Yeah, I marked that down as well. Good. Yeah, good eye. Let's well, let me make sure I've got that. I'm looking loosely at my sheet, but let me just check. So yeah, if you go to the period that he's in currently, Cancer ruled period, ruled by the exalted moon with exalted Jupiter in it, and then if you go down to let's see here, where am I? So if you go down to October 31st, where he's at right now, and then break it down to November 3rd, tomorrow between the 3rd and the 5th, he's in a Taurus period on level 4 between November 3rd and 5th, which contains the exalted moon. So yeah, those are the kinds of things that comparatively in the two charts, this is, you're starting to see the reasoning behind it. And then let's see, if you release from fortune, this is interesting too. If you release from fortune, he's been in a 10th house period as well in Virgo since November of 2013. And in August of 2020 to January of 2023, he will be in an Aquarius period. Now, what's interesting about this? So on the level of fortune, he's in Aquarius period, which is the 10th sign from fortune, a peak period. Now, remember, Donald Trump is in a little bit of a peak period right now as well with fortune. A 10th from fortune, though, is often very powerful for career advancement. And whereas Trump's it's a peak period, but his ruler, remember, is in the 12th. We see he's in an Aquarius period. And during this Aquarius period, Jupiter and Saturn will enter Aquarius, the 10th from fortune, and square the exalted moon with fortune while Uranus is on it. So I would see that as a moment of breakthrough and and victory, but not without challenge, not without some real challenges that come up along the way. That's the nature of the 6th house and big part of his life story. Now, if you go forward to his 77th year, he's in his 77th perfection year. Where does that take us? To the 6th house, the exalted moon and fortune in the 6th house. So there you have it. You know what I mean? It just keeps pointing back to his exalted moon in the 6th, which I would read, if it were any client's chart, as difficulties that you rise above, or that you come out on top somehow. So the hometown guy who rises up from Scranton, Pennsylvania, it's that kind of story, It has
It's
that,
so
even if it's mythic, it's, yeah.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And then Trump stuff, a lot of that pointed back to the 12th house, which is a little bit harder to overcome.
Yeah, exactly. The 6th isn't a breeze, but we're not dealing with an exalted planets in Trump's 12th house, right? We are in Biden's 6th. So now you can see in his progressions, Biden is also coming off from a new moon, right? You can see the moon in Pisces here, about one sign away from the sun. So it was 2019 that he began a new progressed lunar cycle, but rather than being in the 12th like Trump's, his is in the 1st. It's more inceptional, it's more in a more empowered place. Now, something else that you can notice that's a little troubling is that his progressed ascendant is with the South Node right now, which could also speak to health problems. So that is something to watch for. The other thing that's interesting to me here, though, is that look at the aspects that progressed moon is making right now: conjunction with exalted Venus, sextile with exalted Mars, and trine with exalted Jupiter. All the while, his ascendant ruler in this progressed chart is Saturn, right? And Saturn is but you'll notice that Saturn is stationing. He was born with it retrograde. When a planet that you are born with retrograde turns direct, or a planet that you are born with direct turns retrograde by progression, those are major moments of change. When a malefic turns direct and it's your ascendant ruler, that's an improvement in conditions, typically speaking. And again, it's happening here in his progress chart near the IC in the house of good fortune. I would see that as a moment of empowering, of wisdom, maturity, perseverance, things like that. Though, again, this does make me wonder a little bit. Sometimes stationing planets, when they're related to your health house ruler, could, especially if they're malefics, could represent breakdowns in health that are, but again, with it turning direct, I would think that it would be something that would be overcome potentially, as opposed to, say, turning retrograde.
Sorry,
Anyway,
dumb question, but why did you say the health house ruler?
it's first house. Saturn rules the ascendant in his
Oh yeah,
progress
sure,
chart,
sure.
right?
Yeah,
So you're looking at the ascendant ruler turning direct at the IC. Now the stationing, again, sometimes when things station, even if they are turning direct, it's kind of like an end level boss. There's some difficulty, but there's a turnaround and a recovery that happens after it. Anyway, so there are lots of other things that could be said, but the sun here is close to the ascendant. It's in a very empowered place, right? So you're not seeing that, and you don't have an imminent change of the ascendant like you did with Trump, where the whole chart flips. It would be well into his presidency before that change would occur. But whatever does change within it, when the ascendant does change within his presidency, that could be part of the reason that, that loosing of the bond shows a likelihood that he wouldn't be in office for a second term if he did win. So because the ascendant change, if I can just show you this will make more sense if I just show you. So if you take the ascendant ruler, the ascendant itself, progress it, right? And you're gonna, let's go forward just a little bit more. You're getting for Biden, it doesn't really change. It doesn't change over for him until when? Let's see here. Yeah, it doesn't change over for him until the spring of 2025, which would be, months after the inauguration of a new president potentially. At that point, once it does change over, then you're looking at you're at that point, you're looking at the sun moving into the 12th house, and you get more of the feeling like you do with Trump right now, which is some kind of transition space. So if I had to do a long-term prediction just for fun, I would be like, oh, he wins the first term, but he doesn't go 2 terms. He's pretty old, 277, so he'd be like 81. I think that would be the oldest president. But at any rate, so my concerns for Biden's chart mainly have to do with his health and possibly being too optimistic about some of those exalted planets that I was looking at. So does that make sense?
yeah, it does. Yeah, the whole thing is just amazing how many different details that come up when you do start asking those questions. It isn't just as simple as who's going to win. It's all of the other details that come along with it. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite an analysis, and this is why it's not just cut, and it's not like a simple thing. You have to look at multiple timing techniques and try to get a feeling for what is a person. One person should have a chart that looks like on all levels that you're moving towards some kind of difficult transitional space after losing, and one should look like they're stepping into more ascendancy or a period of victory or something like that. So that's basically how I tried to, that's the lens through which I was looking at both charts. But that's of course you're assuming in that things look and go as you would expect them to go with a win or a loss. You know what I mean? So it's
Yeah,
not.
there are
Yeah.
certain assumptions that you have to make.
Yes, exactly.
And there was another lot that you were going to show us.
Oh yeah, that's a really interesting one. So I'll just mention it because it's too hard to show on the screen because it involves too much. But basically, one thing to look at would be very close to an election. Do you see either candidate, the incumbent who's would be losing? Do you see any planets hitting the lot of resignation or dismissal, which is one of the kind of lots that was used in horary and other things? Um, the lot of resignation and dismissal is at 18 Capricorn for Trump. The sun will eclipse that degree of resignation and dismissal. It'll conjoin that degree on the very day or within like 24 hours of Venus's opposition to Mars that we were just talking about at the beginning. So let me bring it up on the screen and show you what I mean in real time. So here's the real time clock. Now with lots, sometimes you're kind of like, you have to be careful not to go down a rabbit hole with lots, which I very well could be doing right now. So, but let's take this forward. So look at what happens when the sun gets onto his lot of resignation and dismissal when it's at 18 degrees. What's happening in the day before that and the day after that? Here's the sun at 17 degrees coming onto the lot of resignation and dismissal in his chart, where Venus is opposing Mars in the sky at the same time, which looks like it could be something, some kind of fight or some kind of contest, right? Struggle, and not peaceful transition kind of energy. But then, right as Venus overcomes that by moving into the next degree over, where Venus will then start moving into the superior position over Mars, then the sun moves on to the lot of designation of resignation and dismissal. At the same exact time that is happening, you know, almost at the exact same time, right? You've got Jupiter and Pluto conjoining, and they're doing so in an opposition to Trump's Venus and Saturn. And then if you bring in Uranus and Neptune, you are also going to see something that's really interesting. So it's, oops. Oh, no, I lied. It's, yeah, here it is. And then what's so interesting is that Neptune stations, by the way, just one little extra point of emphasis, Neptune stations and turns direct, right? This is later in the month on the 29th into the 30th, right when the eclipse then comes over, excuse me, the eclipse will come in Gemini. So why am I saying that? Because what does that signify in Trump's chart? Well, what's going to happen when that Neptune moves direct? The next thing it will do is square his lights. So that the eclipse and Neptune turning direct and then moving straight toward the square with the lights would tell me that there's if I had to guess, and this is just like a, you know, we're just being a totally educated guesser here, I would say that by the 10th or the 11th, there's some kind of if he loses, one scenario that I could see would be some kind of contesting in the courts and so forth, with a period around the 10th or the 11th where Venus and Mars are opposing, right? And then you get Jupiter and Pluto conjoining, and then you get the sun right on the lot of resignation and dismissal. That seems to me like a fight lost. If you take it forward to the end of the month, then boom, Neptune turns direct and starts moving toward the square with his lights right as the eclipse in Gemini comes in the sign of his sun. So yeah, that's a pretty full-bodied analysis, but I promise you this, everyone listening, that I'm doing this because I love astrology, and I will show up and, you know, try to take a look at where I got things right and where I got things wrong. And that way we can all learn, because if you don't do that as an astrologer and you're just, it's all about your ego, you know, you'll never get better at what you're doing. So, you know, my promise to everyone is that we'll follow up on this at some point and see how things play out and sort of revisit all of this together so that you can all learn from it. And what I would appreciate in the meantime is that even though this is triggery subject matter for a lot of us, because a lot of us, you know, have a horse in the race and we have our heart and soul and we're so invested in it, is to really just watch this as a student of astrology, and please be respectful to everyone in this forum. Yeah.
May the best man win.
Yeah. And I have to say big thanks to Kat for being here. The reason people might be like, Kat didn't say a lot, you know, she just kind of sat there. And the reason that Kat's here is because it is very hard for me to do this kind of analysis in a vacuum without someone there to just kind of tell me, is this making sense? Are you with me? And to just offer any feedback or insight or like little commentary as I go. It's just a very grounding thing for me to have someone here with me when I do it. It also helps me imagine that I'm talking to a person rather than just no one when I'm recording, which I need, especially for this one, because this is one that for me is really intimidating to do because it's just one of those videos that, I can get hate mail from or whatever. And so it's just nice to have a friend with me. So thank you for Kat for being here today.
You're welcome. Everyone be nice.
Check Kat's work out at thecreativeintrovert.com. If you like this kind of stuff, if you're like, man, this kind of stuff is so interesting, it is to me too. That's why I do it every day. My new course, Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic, starts on November 14th. There's still time to sign up. There are payment plans. There is need-based tuition. There's an early bird rate. So check it out on my website. And if you have any questions, email me, info@nightlightastrology.com. All right, so that's what we've got for today. And tomorrow, I believe I will be doing, rather than focusing on anything election oriented, tomorrow we'll be going into, I think, the 9th part of my series on 10 things I've learned in 10 years of traditional astrology, 10 years of practicing astrology. So hopefully you guys will have something spiritually nourishing to take in tomorrow when your nerves might be high. All right, that's what I've got for all of you. Thanks so much and have a great week. Take care, everyone. Bye.